Well, how's it going, everybody? I wanted to pick up on a conversation that's sort of been going on online and bring it into the passage from Mark 10. Now, Mark 10, I think, actually bears some similarities to these online conversations about who Jesus is. I've been sort of picking some fights, if you will, or at least provoking people to think through their assumptions about who Jesus is. And I'll engage with this post from Apostate Prophet here in a second, but essentially it's based off of the shroud. He says this doesn't look like a first century Jewish man. I ask him, do you mean a Judean man? He says, I said Jewish. And so there's a reason I think some people are unwilling to clarify what they mean. And so I'll get to that, but I think Mark 10 really gives us a good backdrop to what's going on today online. So there's this crowd, right? And Jesus is leaving Jericho, and this crowd comes around him, disciples, a large crowd, and a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. Bartimaeus shares a lot of similarities to other people who draw near to Jesus. He's blind. He is essentially unnamed, and so he's a very lowly figure in this. Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. Bartimaeus just means the son of Timaeus, and so essentially he's an unnamed person. Except Mark here does us the favor and includes these details. You can also pick up this story in Luke, but the story in Mark gives us a really fascinating glimpse into how the crowd sees Jesus versus how Bartimaeus sees Jesus. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out, saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. So he hears from the crowd that this is Jesus the Nazarene, but he calls out to Jesus, son of David, which is a really interesting piece to the puzzle of who is Jesus. Was he a Nazarene, or was he the son of David, a Judean? And I think in some ways he's both. And so when people say Jesus is a Jew, I just ask them to clarify what they mean by that. So the crowd will say Jesus is fill in the blank. Jesus is a Jew. Jesus is a Nazarene. Jesus is a Galilean. And yet Bartimaeus really gets us to focus our attention on what do we actually think when we picture the person of Jesus? When we imagine who is Jesus to you? Who is Jesus to me? He's more than a Galilean. He's more than a Nazarene. He's more than a Judean. He's more than Jewish. He's more than even the son of David. But that's what Bartimaeus gets us to sort of think about. Is he the king? Son of David, have mercy on me. Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more. He's a lowly, desperate person, right? Son of David, have mercy on me. And it's the mercy part that actually extends the vision of even the son of David into a greater picture of who Jesus is. He is the one upon whom I need to call for mercy. That is sort of divine, like, right? This would be essentially, who do I need to go? If I'm going to receive mercy, who do I need to go to? Well, I need to go to God, who is merciful. And that's what Bartimaeus goes to Jesus for that. And Jesus stopped and said, call him here. Okay. So they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, stand up. He's calling you. I think this is so funny. Jesus knows he's blind, right? And I've talked about this before, but I wanted to bring this up again in the context of this online discussion about who Jesus is and how people sort of fill in those blanks. Jesus does this really, it's humorous. This is comedy here. Call the blind man here. Jesus can see, Bartimaeus can't see. And yet Jesus doesn't go to Bartimaeus. He says, hey, tell Bartimaeus to come find me. Essentially, I mean, I'm being sort of interpretive here. Call Bartimaeus. Tell him to come find me. Saying to him, take courage, stand up. He is calling for you. And this is what I love about Mark telling this story. And throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. how does a blind man know where Jesus is when Jesus is in the midst of a crowd? In answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? Again, humor, right? I mean, he's a blind man. And Jesus is like, what's up, man? What do you want me to do? You look good to me. He's like, well, I'm blind. Like, Rabboni, I want to regain sight. I think Jesus is kind of hinting at the fact that Bartimaeus can already see. Bartimaeus sees something the crowd doesn't see. And that's why I am kind of provoking people online to reconsider their assumptions about this man, Jesus, that we talk about. And Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well. And immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. See, his sort of spiritual sight, if you will, his supernatural sight, his metaphysical sight was clear. And his physical sight was restored to him. The crowd calls Jesus a Nazarene. Bartimaeus calls Jesus the son of David. Bartimaeus calls upon Jesus for mercy. And I think that in one way, I want to make my position clear when I ask people, hey, when you say Jesus is a Jew, what is it that you mean? What do you mean by that? And so I asked Apostate prophet, do you mean a first century, do you mean a Judean man in the first century? Now, I'll give him credit because he does say, okay, so he says, the reconstruction of the shroud looks more like a Norse raider than a Jewish man in the first century. At least he gives us this. But not many people even lend that much context. They'll just say, Jesus is a Jew. And then when you say, well, what do you mean by that? Because it can mean a couple of things, and we don't want to be anachronistic. It risks being sort of like reading our modern context back into this ancient context. So at least he prevents the anachronism there. But a Jewish man in the first century. So I say, do you mean a Judean man? Again, because the New Testament word can be translated Judean or Jew. So we're looking for clarification. He says, I said Jewish. Okay, so this takes me to another point. And I want to know what you guys think about this, because I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly if I feel that strongly about this, but I'm starting to understand why people who say Jesus is a Jew hesitate to clarify what they mean. It's just like, don't ask any more questions. Just this, this one fact. And it's sort of it's kind of like a dog whistle or a virtue signal or something like that. It's like, you're in this group if you don't ask questions. Just say the words, right? Like babble, like you see everything going on in the news, like the whatever the radical leftist, woke mind virus people will just say, these are the words that you're supposed to repeat. And it feels like one of those. Just, Jesus is a Jew, don't ask any questions. But of course, there's a very obvious question, which is, what do you mean by that? And I'm starting to understand why people hesitate to clarify this. Maybe they don't know what they mean. But I think if you're going to say it, we need to understand, like, kind of more clearly what you mean. Because it's starting to sound to me like a veiled appeal to authority, an attempt to portray Christianity as less qualified than Judaism on matters of divinity, or Christians as less qualified than Jews on matters of divinity, or even the identity of Jesus. It's like, trust the experts here. That's why it's like, Jesus is a Jew. Okay, what do you mean by that? Just trust the experts. Well, who are the experts? Well, the Jews are the experts. And so Christians need to go to the Jews to find out who Jesus is. And when you go to the Jews to find out who Jesus is, you get a very different picture of who Jesus is than the biblical Jesus, the Christian Jesus. And so I do think it's an important conversation to have. And I will say this, because I'm sure that as soon as I post this on something like Twitter, the chances of it being misunderstood are fairly high, which is part of the reason why I wanted to do a video and sort of dialogue about it. And and though I'm going to try to craft this language as best as I can, people who are looking for anti-Semitism will find it anywhere, even in a person who's not being anti-Semitic. Just somebody who's saying, okay, well, Jesus was a first century man who lived he's from Nazareth. He's not, technically, he was born in Bethlehem of Judea. And I've done other podcasts on this that I will leave in a playlist and in a link down below, because there is a lot to this. But I really think it's important to understand Jesus' ministry in the north and his ministry in the south. I think this is Ezekiel 37. This is the one shepherd. He has two sticks. He's bringing the two sticks into his hand. It's Israel in the north, Ephraim, and it's Judah being brought together. So with that, I think Christians can learn something. Christians and Jews can learn something from each other, which is why I would like to promote more conversation. Shout out to Keith Foskey and Jacob Federecci. I know that they just did either a live stream or a video together where they talked for over an hour, I think. So we want to promote more of this. Now, I will say, as a Christian person, Christians should demonstrate that they have something to say that's worth listening to. And cards on the table, I will be completely honest, I think Jewish people have a lot to learn about the person of Jesus from Christians. But Christians need to demonstrate that they have something that people need to listen to. And I hope that we're doing that. And I hope that we can learn from each other. Now, of course, I want everyone to come to a true knowledge of Jesus, because I think outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, outside of the person of Jesus Christ, there is no hope for humanity. And I care about people. At least I try to. I'm a pretty selfish person, but I do try. But even online, I care about people. I care about Apostate Prophet. I care about his soul and what he thinks about the person of Jesus. And I think he is becoming an Orthodox Christian. So, of course, as a Christian person, how you communicate the person of Jesus is very important. And I would encourage Apostate Prophet to consider this. So his response to me was, I said Jewish. He doesn't want to clarify, what do you mean by Jewish? I got somebody talk to me, and I thought that was, it's like, at least you're clarifying. That's what we want to do. But he doesn't want to. Of course, maybe he's too busy for me. I've got, I don't garnish a lot of attention online, and he certainly does. And so I can understand that maybe he doesn't have the time to respond to someone like me. But I would think that if you're going to say Jesus is, and you fill in the blank, that it would be important to make sure you're not misunderstood. Because here's one crazy thing to think about. The New Testament doesn't ever associate Jesus with Judaism. I'm just going to put that out for Christians to consider, for Jewish people to consider. It's not Judaism. Paul references Judaism. In Galatians 1, Paul talks about his former life in Judaism. You have it in verse 13 and 14. I did point this out when I was trying to engage with Father Stephen DeYoung on the topic. He was saying Jesus is a follower of... Jesus would be a follower of the namas of the Judeans, Judeos mas, and yet when you poke that a little bit, when you look into it, that word is only used twice in the New Testament, both by Paul and both in reference to his former life. Now, again, this is that veiled appeal to authority that, and somehow I would need to go to somebody of the Jewish faith to learn what it means to be a Christian, even though Paul, a Christian, walked away from his Judaism. He talks about it in the past tense. Jesus is never associated with this term in the New Testament. Now, of course, does he follow the law of Moses, the law that God gave to Israel? Of course. Of course. Is that Judaism? Let me know what you think about that. I don't know that the religion that was handed to Israel from Sinai is Judaism. It doesn't seem to be if Paul, this Christian man, this has walked away from it and followed Christ. And so it seems like there is again, I'll own where Christians have gotten wrong. It's like there's a true religion out there. There's truly what God wants from us, and none of us has it figured out completely. Now, I do think in Christ, that's where we have reconciliation. That's where we have salvation. So although I'm incomplete in my theology, I am rescued by God. It's not that I have to come up to God. God has come down to me in the person of Christ. And so I have that promise, the promise that was made. Okay, so does that make sense? Like if the New Testament wanted us to understand Jesus as a follower of Judaism, then the gospel writers and anyone else in the New Testament would have made that connection for us. But they don't appear to do that. Paul brings it up as a former way of life that he walked away from so that he could go follow Jesus. So Jesus, in that sense, he's not Jewish in that sense. He's clearly not Jewish in that sense, according to the way the gospel writers understood Jesus, or Paul as he's referring to his former life, Paul who followed Jesus. So when you say, I said Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, what do you mean? Culturally? Ethnically? Let's clarify it. Because I think there's something to that conversation. And in what way is Jesus Jewish? In what way is he Galilean? And what does it mean that his ministry is a ministry to both the nations and the Gentiles and to Jerusalem? There's something to that. And so if you are here at the end of this ranting video, I appreciate you. I appreciate you being here. I will post links to the playlists and anything else that I feel is helpful as I work through this. And I'll catch you in the next one.